I had this idea in my head, and it's a really contentious kind of notion. And it's been bouncing around there for a long time. And like a lot of ideas, we tend to think of them as being pretty good until we get to trying to explain them or trying to argue them, trying to take a position or even find a position to discuss something. And I've had this notion, this intuition that recycling isn't a good thing. It isn't a good idea. And not in the sense that we should just like throw things away, but that it isn't what people think. It isn't how it was sold. It is a notion that we have now really integrated into our, let's say, civilization, and that it's not going to do what we think it's going to do. So let's start with some of the basics. When recycling was introduced en masse, it was sold as there's a finite amount of, let's just roughly call it resources, and that things were being thrown away, which we shouldn't be throwing away because we're just making huge landfills full of stuff, that we could reduce the amount that's going to them, and then we can take that stuff and we can recycle it and do things with it again. And there has been a whole lot of the kind of culture of wanting to save the earth, and that position has changed over the years. I've seen it change over the years, and I'm on board with all of the ideas there. But I know a few things because I'm older now. I've seen a few things. So stuff like recycling is providing free materials to some companies, more or less free. So they don't have to go and dig up the stuff from wherever and make the stuff. They can go to landfills and get it for cheap. Or essentially, the end consumer is donating for zero profit to wherever recycling goes. And one of the concerns about recycling is that it doesn't necessarily go to recycling plants. In some places, I've heard in some places still, it actually goes to the same place that regular garbage goes to, because they don't have the proper facilities. But there is, let's ignore that and think more idealistically. There is still an inefficiency that's there in recycling. Recycling used to be a thing, we would call it reusing, where we'd have glass bottles for like our soda pop. So we'd have our Coca-Cola in a bottle, even up to 2-liter bottles, these big heavy things. And if you were a kid and you bought one of those, you're like lugging it around. You need 2 hands. You get strong enough that you can hold it by its neck, and it's just one of those things. And you'd be able to wash that glass and reuse it again, although it would be melted down and used again. And that's not a perfect solution. And one of the things that people think about recycling is that that it kind of closes the loop, but it's an incredibly inefficient, arduous process. Now, not only does a new infrastructure have to be created, that it's not quite parallel to waste collection, but it reuses a lot of the same understanding. You need entirely new facilities to manage all this stuff, and you need new facilities and new expertise for a lot of the different, let's call it, specialties of dealing with different kinds of recycled material. And so a huge industry has sprung up around either getting or processing or storing or using all of these recycled goods. And I don't disapprove of any of that. It's kind of looking into that isn't something that I want to think about right now. But I do want to think in terms of, from the consumer side of things, their perspective on their contribution to the inevitable destruction of our planet. And I'm going to call it an inevitability because recycling is inefficient. First, recycling isn't 100%, but there is stuff that has to go into the recycling process that people, some people are just willfully blind, but I think it's just that most people have never really thought about it, or things have been quietly kept from the public mind. That's things like, well, okay, if you use less of a certain thing because you're recycling it, then that's good. Well, but you're using more of other things in order to make that reusable. For example, back to the glass example, in order to get that glass, you have to have it picked up. To get it picked up and carted around takes fossil fuels, takes trucks, takes all the scaffolding to make all of that possible, all the manpower to physically drive things or to move things around, all the mechanics, all of the technology in the actual trucks. And it gets to a plant, and has to be a specialty plant that does this kind of stuff, and that doesn't run off of thin air. And it's going to have electricity that gets used. Where's that electricity coming from? It's got to have heat to melt the glass and then to shape it. And then, so you've got all the machinery and stuff that needs to exist to repurpose, and that's just glass. I think it's pretty safe to consider that the most recyclable material ever, because you can turn glass into glass again. It isn't 100%, but I mean, philosophically, it could be. Nothing else could be. Not yet. There's some kind of not in the public eye stuff that's being experimented with that's theoretically 100%, but if it's used by something, and if there's a residue of that something on it, then you'll never be able to recycle it 100% unless you can get rid of that something. Theoretically, the only stuff that could be perfectly recyclable is metals, which you can essentially dissolve in things like acids and then reaccumulate the particles with other methods. Like you can recrystallize, is it silver? And you can pull copper by having a charged plate attract the particles. And other materials you can just melt down and separate out. And if you just keep doing that and just separate the perfect stuff, and you leave the I don't know how good this is stuff down below, if you can see that, and just pour more and more of it and just take the good stuff every time, like creating good clarified butter, then it's possible to have perfect efficiency. But for something like glass, let's imagine it's perfect. Then there's still a lot of stuff going in. It isn't just I take my bottle, it vanishes into thin air, and a new bottle appears with the new material. There's stuff that goes in. There's a massive industry. And I think that people think too highly of the idea of recycling because they don't quite realize the amount of other stuff that needs to go into there, including other stuff that is not environmentally friendly. So fossil fuels is the big one. If you bring that up, a lot of people will, they'll get it. They'll get the idea. There are more subtle things, but fossil fuels is the big one. Not many people know where their electricity comes from. In some places, it will come from coal. And people don't understand coal well enough. And there's this idea of clean coal being bandied about that I don't understand anything about. I do know that a lot of companies are squirrely about having scrubbers in their smokestacks, and that's just for other heavy industry stuff. I don't know how coal would do that at all. But even that has consequences. I mean, are they scrubbing it with activated charcoal? Would be how some households say filter their water better. And that has a material that has to be acquired, mined, or manufactured somehow, assembled and shipped, right there is already, you're talking about electricity being used to create a product. You're talking about fossil fuels to ship the product. Talking about using the product, and then what? You're throwing that product away. So you might be getting your wonderful recycled stuff. Awesome, right? You might be contributing to it. But the fact that the electricity that went into the process to make that recycling happen might come from fossil fuels, and even the processes that make that source of fuel, that source of energy, that might make it less environmentally impactful, those have consequences too. Well, what happens if how does your perception of things change if you were to learn that the source of your electricity was from fossil fuel, but there were things that mediate the environmental impact, but those mediations created more waste? So you have to throw out the reusable filters. I'm making that up because I don't know. So there's things about recycling that people don't fully understand. It's like it's there as this thing to appease people's worry about how much of a personal responsibility they have for how they live, what products they use, this sort of stuff. And it's from that angle that I want to explore from that kind of position of the everyday person, which is to say, I'm helping, I'm offloading my impact. But the thing is, they're only reducing it because of that inefficiency of recycling and because of all those other things which have to go into the recycling as well to make that actually happen. So they're just kind of diminishing it. And here's the thing. The notion of recycling back in my day was sold on the idea that the world is a kind of terrarium where everything is closed and we have to use the same thing again and again. And this is why, at least in Canada, the recycling symbol is the arrows. Reduce, reuse, recycle. And the notion is that we can take this waste and we can pull it back by putting it into that loop. Now, that should be reduce, reuse, recycle, repair. That's a different issue. But the idea that it is kind of a feel-good, not quite, placebo isn't the right word. It's a thing that people, it lets them feel good about themselves. It's like a carbon tax, which is another, which has problems. The philosophy behind it isn't very healthy, let's say. Okay, so what I did want to say is that the efficiency of closing that loop into recycling, it isn't 100% after all. So theoretically, what's happening is consumers are using things and recycling the things, and they feel good about themselves, like I'm doing my part. Yeah. And they don't understand all of these other things that are at play. So that's a problem. And because it's inefficient to do this recycling, it doesn't matter over the long term, because all that's happening is this recycling concept is stretching out the deadline to the utter disaster of us living in this wasteland that's just covered in garbage. And that's the general idea that a lot of people have. It's not exactly wrong, because if let's say if your city was on a large island and you were to act the way you act, that island is going to fill up with garbage. And recycling will definitely reduce that deadline, but it's going to come. It has to. It will come. And if we just expand that out to the earth and all the cities on earth, it's an inevitability that we're just going to fill the world up with garbage. And that there are problems with that. First off, all the civilizations of the past have built on top of garbage, as archaeologists have discovered. But we are technically not just working with the surface of the earth. We are technically working with the crust, even though we don't really have access to most of that. So in theory, we could take all of our garbage and toss it down pits and have it churned up in let's say continental plates. having all of our garbage go down. So theoretically speaking, we could use the entirety of the Earth as kind of a garbage dump and push stuff into magma. I mean, theoretically, but ultimately speaking, realistically speaking, there is this deadline that of the conclusion of our let's say our blissful ignorance, where we have to just recognize that we have no place to throw stuff anymore. And recycling, because it's inefficient, will only extend that deadline. So I've been imagining this as something like all of the Earth and all of its people are in a car driving, and the inefficiencies of our existence, our littering, our consumption, is like us stepping on the gas and driving. But there's this cliff out there, and we know it's out there. We've seen it. Well, we imagine it. Authors have seen it. And recycling is there. But recycling, recycling does is it takes the foot a little bit off. It eases it off of the gas a little bit, but the car's still going. And there are some arguments that say that there's a hill and that we need to do more than just take our foot off the gas. But we have no concept of what it would be to actually do that. Like, how do we close the loop so well that our foot's off the gas, that we will never approach that cliff? We don't know what that means. And that's one of the problems that I personally have struggled with from a science fiction writer perspective. Because I don't know that I've actually talked about this very much, but I think in extreme long term, kind of like the timeline, I stretch it out. And that's one way of understanding kind of now, is by thinking about thousands of years in the future. And one of the problems is like our sun's going to die. Okay, our sun's going to live a good long time, but while it's living a good long time, it's actually going to expand and swallow the Earth. It's more complicated than that, because I'm not sure what happens as stars age. Our star, when it ages, will expand, and its expansion will be out past the orbit of the Earth. What happens to the Earth between now and then, I actually don't know. I haven't looked into that. Somebody knows. At any rate, that at the very least is something finite. And we do know that we're going to have to escape the Earth. Escape is the right way to say it. And so theoretically speaking, if we just extend our garbage dump of a planet out enough for us to escape, doesn't matter, right? As long as we take everything, pick up our entire civilization and move with it. And I say our entire civilization like there's only one, because technically there would only be one that survives. That's the one that's capable of space flight. But I think it's bigoted of me to use that as a singular. So let's say whatever the heck humanity is, its fragments that survive have to go elsewhere. That has to be an inevitability. Thinking positively, the humanity that survives that cataclysm has to have certain philosophies in mind. And those philosophies have to be such that let's remove most of the science fiction, which is faster than light travel or gates or something like that we actually have to physically go from point A to point B, where point B is another Earth. Let's just make it perfect. Is a better Earth. And we have to think of humanity as surviving from the travel from A to B. So if this entire Earth were completely destroyed by our inefficiency in recycling, but we managed to escape, the philosophies that made it inevitable that we ruined the Earth, that we let's say turned it into a garbage dump, the limitation of the fact that we couldn't make recycling perfect travels with that ship. So it has to be something like, it has to be a ship that survives as long as the planet did, such that from the transit between A and B, it won't become an unusable trash heap before it gets to B. Now, you could science fiction that and say something like, well, we're faster than light, or something like that. And that's fine, but the philosophy is still such that there has to be an efficiency between A and B such that it survives the arrival to B. And if we have sublight speed, so it's going to take a minimum of thousands of years for a conventional speed ship to accelerate to a halfway point and then decelerate on its way to arriving to somewhere, that time, the loop has to be closed well enough that the humans that survive will actually be able to arrive and have, functional circumstances. We can't have just a few like human rats living among the garbage heap of these ships, because I think of those ships as generation ships. I don't even know where I heard that from or if I made that up, but we have to have multiple generations of humans being born, living, and dying in a very confined space, like that island. And a ship, nothing really goes in or out. I mean, you could toss stuff out an airlock, done. And you can pick up material from the outside, theoretically, but not really. Not really. It's even hard to get rid of things like heat. There are some really extreme problems. So a very long-term thinker would take the problems of recycling on Earth and extend them out to the lifespan of the Earth, and then take those problems and put them on a ship and extend that to the life of the transit. And here's the problem, is if humans can't get their act together for their limited time on Earth, and I mean limited time is like billions of years, I'm hopeful like that. If we can't get that loop perfect, that imperfect loop will propagate out into ships, and that will have to be like, we pull as much material as possible up into ships in orbit, like we collect bits of our solar system together so we have material, and then that travels. I mean, there's nothing stopping us from assembling, like we wouldn't take chunks of the Earth because it's hard to get stuff up into space. We wouldn't take the moon because we'd have to pull it out of orbit, and that's hard. We'd go to the asteroid belt and we'd mine the material we need, because there's a lot of we've got an asteroid belt that's at least one failed planet, as I understand. It's things didn't work out and it kind of broke apart, and so there's a lot of material there, but there's not a lot of biological material and a lot of other things that we'd want. And that's easier to get moving because it's not locked in orbit around something. So let's pretend like we can assemble a whole lot of our solar system and survive well enough. That whatever the heck has to survive like another little mini planet to get to someplace else. And if that philosophy of living on the Earth ends up being parasitic to the Earth itself, but we survive it, it doesn't really matter, right? We survive well enough, but the sun's going to swallow the Earth, so who cares? That's reasonable. And we pull that philosophy up into a ship, and we use that material up, and it doesn't matter because we're getting to a new planet anyway. Well, that philosophy now, that fundamental limitation of both philosophy or culture or civilization or technology, it propagated out into another planet, and the same thing is just going to happen again and again for forever. And for me, the problem of recycling is our stretching out that inevitability such that our present generations are playing pretend like that deadline isn't there. And it sounds like, the evil thing to say, right? And it should feel like a knee-jerk reaction. But the reason why recycling is bad is because it lets us ignore that inevitability, and it means that we don't have to just pull the bandage off and face the bloody truths of our actual impact. Because if we didn't have any recycling, if we didn't have any notion of any of this at all, there would be a hard wall that we get right up close to, and then we'd actually have to freak out and fix things. But this just slow boiling in a pot of water that we're doing means that at every moment we're just getting used to it. We're getting used to this, we're getting used to the next bit, and every generation that goes forward has no real concept of what life was like 50 years ago. Doesn't We don't live near our landfills, and when we start doing that, it'll be like a little one outside the city, and a little one down the block, and then a little one out our door, and then a little one in our house, and then but every generation will be slowly boiling alive, not quite seeing what's happening. But if there were no such illusion of recycling, illusion of help, illusion of the efficiency of it, that then a generation would have to face that right away, could not turn from that fact, that inevitability. And if we can't do that, then that problem will still arise on the Earth, and then the ship, and then the next planet, and then the next planet, and then humans will just spread around with this parasite notion of consuming the entirety of a planet, and then surviving it, fleeing, some of them fleeing, and gentrifying out into the solar system, and then consuming and doing it again. And part of the I don't directly write about it as such. I mean, I've got some bits about it that deals with that particular side of things, like how what kind of civilization would exist that ended up not overcoming the challenge of the perfect terrarium is not the right word, is it? The just the perfect closed loop of taking the same what they have access to and constantly reusing it perfectly. What kind of civilization would exist that never tried doing that in the first place, and what kind of civilization would exist that is constantly scared of not being able to do it perfectly, but tries really hard. Of which, first off, one would consume the other, and what would that do for the lifespan of the entirety of the universe? And again, I think in those scales. So my reasoning against recycling is that it lets us willfully turn away from a lot of the actual problems that are out there. We play pretend like we aren't contributing as much as we really are to the death of the planet. We don't see all the infrastructure that needs to go into making this supposed recycling actually happen. So where electricity comes from, for example. We don't face that. And one of the most interesting things is most people don't realize that most of the garbage that is produced isn't produced by them, isn't produced by households, isn't produced by regular everyday citizens. It's produced by businesses. The vast majority of the concerns that recycling was manufactured to alleviate, that culture, that theme in our civilization now, most of that was created and directed toward citizens. And those citizens, now appeased, don't see it as big as as big of a problem as it really is, because they don't realize that the real problem isn't with everyday people. The problem is the manufacturers, etc., of the products that they consume, not the products that they consume. It's where they come from. It's not the packaging that they need to recycle or throw out. It's where that product came from and all of the inefficiencies in getting and transporting the material, in making it, and all of that kind of stuff. It vastly, vastly impacts that garbage dump of a planet more than the citizens do. And by being appeased by this concept of recycling, they don't think that the problem is as big as it really is. And I know it's not the right perspective, but I like entertaining the notion that if household recycling weren't a thing, that citizens would be more concerned about the, let's say, the larger problems that recycling is for alleviating, that they would look into industry, which is the biggest problem. And people don't participate in industry level, let's call it politics or culture, as much as they should. That people, everyday people, focus on their own lives. They only think about their own lives. So that's really all. I mean, we don't have a whole lot of expertise or time or interest to go around to fulfill our other duties of paying attention to the rest of the world. That people are very easily appeased by looking down at their feet and not up toward the root of where all of their stuff comes from, of how industry works, how business works, how international manufacturing, etc., works. And that's an entirely different thing. But yeah, so recycling, good. Recycling the way we're doing it, nice try. We need to do it to get efficient. Perfection is the only way we can actually do anything. I mean, we need to get close to perfection. Otherwise, I mean, I don't want to say otherwise, what's the point? But recycling is smoothing out the curve towards living in and on a garbage dump. I think I'm going to stop now. So yeah, spoilers for the book, although it's not science fiction. So yeah, hopefully that was interesting.